everybody. Welcome to our last session of 2020. How nice it is to say the last session of 2020, the last of 2020. I think we all want to see the end of 2020. It's my absolutely pleasure to introduce our chair and speakers today. I'm just going to introduce the chair, and then the chair will introduce the speakers, because we've got two today, which is a novelty for us. So with us, we have as a chair for this event, Rebecca, I call her Becky, Rebecca Hardwick from the University of Plymouth. She's a postdoctoral research fellow in health services research. And she's in the Peninsula Medical School. She's very experienced realist, having written many papers and chapters. She wrote a chapter with Rob Anderson and Mark Pearson in the Doing Realist Research book that we published a couple of years ago about using, how cost effectiveness could be looked at from the realist perspective. But she's written a lot about knowledge and knowledge mobilization. Anyway, there we go, Rebecca, off to you.
Thanks very much, Anna. That's okay. And so I'd just like to introduce our speakers today. Just give me just a sec. We've got Lynn and Natasha joining us from the University of Bradford. Lynn has a varied background in university administration, counselling and qual research. And she started working on the Born in Bradford research project at the Bradford Institute for Health Research before she did her PhD in psychotherapy and counselling at the University of Leeds, which she completed in 2018. She's worked with realist methods on this project, the Qual-Dash project, from 2017 to 2020, and her research interests focused on investigating people's cognitive and emotional responses to healthcare interventions, whether or not these derive from human intersubjective interactions, as in counselling, or are digitally based. Tasha has been involved in applied health services research for over 10 years. Her interests are in implementation and evaluation of complex interventions, in particular how they work to improve practice and patient outcomes. And she's used realist evaluation in a number of projects in the context of community stroke care for her PhD, for the Qual-Dash project, which what they're talking about today, and to understand the impact of robotic surgery on teamwork and communication in the operating theatre. I've just got a few housekeeping things to take us through, but just wanted to say welcome to everybody. It's great to have you all here. So how it runs is like this. Please can you mute your microphones and have your video off unless you're speaking. There'll be 30 minutes for the speakers to present and then 30 minutes for questions. Please no interrupting as the speakers are speaking. Just make a note maybe in your notebook of some questions that you might want to ask, and then once it's finished you can put those in the chat. The event, as Anna said, will be recorded and is going to be made available later on the RealismLeeds website, so you can share it with your friends. And questions will be on a first come, first serve basis, similar to if you're in a conference or seminar when people walk up to a microphone. We'd like you to keep your questions brief and to the point. And if you want to ask a question, just post it in the chat function, and I will call your name based on the order your name appeared on the chat list. And when I call your name, then you can turn on your mic and video. You don't have to turn on your video. Okay, so that's all our housekeeping. I hope that's okay with everybody. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll hand over now to Lynn and Tasha.
Right, thank you ever so much, Becky, for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Becky?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you, Anna, for organising this, and thank you everybody for turning out. Well, I was going to say so early on a freezing cold Friday morning, but for some of you it's really late, so that's even more amazing, so thank you. So Tasha and I today are going to talk about the Qual-Dash project. This is a project that we've both worked on, which has used realist methods to both evaluate and develop a quality dashboard in the NHS. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge our funders, the National Institute for Health Research, Health Services and Delivery Research Programme. So to summarise then what we'll cover today, I'll start by talking about the study background and aims, and especially about the realist framework and structure within this study. And then Tasha will talk about developing and refining the QualDash context mechanism outcome configurations, and particularly about mechanisms that informed the dashboard development and impacted on its use in practice. And then I'll sum up at the end with some lessons learned, and I'll focus on using realist approaches in software development especially. So to start with the background then, so the QualDash quality dashboard that this project aimed to develop and evaluate was designed to work to help users explore national clinical audit data. And if you've not come across national clinical audits before, in the UK, NHS organisations participate in over 50 of these audits, and they provide public reports of data, often in the form of annual reports, but sometimes in other formats, about patient treatments and outcomes in different clinical areas. So there is, for example, a diabetes national clinical audit, there are several heart attack national clinical audits, and so on. And they're not just in the UK, there are similar bodies in many countries. Sometimes similar bodies are called things like clinical registries as well. So national clinical audits are designed to facilitate measurement of care quality to support both quality assurance and improvement. But it's known that there's some variation in their use, especially for improvement. And it was against that background that in 2016, the NIHR Health Services and Delivery Research Programme issued a call for research on, well, they wanted to see projects that would improve feedback of the results of national clinical audits. And I guess their theory was that if you could improve the way the results were fed back to users, users would be more likely to use the data for a range of things, including quality improvement. So our project, the QualDash project, was funded against that call, and it was funded to develop and evaluate QualDash, which is an interactive web-based quality dashboard that aimed to support hospital staff to better understand and make use of these national clinical audit data. Our theory was that that would lead to improved quality of care and clinical outcomes, and so the project was involved testing and refining that theory. And we took a realist approach throughout, not just to evaluating the dashboard once it had been developed, but actually to developing it as well. So we carried out an initial context analysis, and from that developed CMOs, which we then used to both co-design QualDash and an associated adoption strategy. Our approach to program theory and CMOs was influenced by Sonia Delkin et al.'s excellent paper on what's in a mechanism. So for us, the way we sort of operationalised that, so mechanisms having both resources and reasoning, so consisting of both of those kinds of facets. In terms of resources, we were looking at what national clinical audit feedback offers to providers, and then how providers, in terms of reasoning, reason about and respond to that. And that was impacted on, of course, by the context. And we were interested to find out what was it about the context that supported or constrained that reasoning, and then together led to different outcomes, how the feedback was used and with what impact. So in terms of the structure of the project then, for our sample we sought variation in terms of the national clinical audits the dashboard would be designed around, the hospitals where we would trial it and test it and design it, and the professionals who would help us construct and refine our program theory, but also use the dashboard. So in terms of national clinical audits, although we looked at a range of different audits and gathered information about those, the dashboard itself was designed to work with two. The Myocardial Ischemia National Audit Project, or MINAP, which is a heart attack audit, and the Paediatric Intensive Care Audit Network, or PICANET. And we worked with 5 hospitals in total in England. 3 of those were large teaching hospitals that had both cardiology departments that contributed to MINAP and paediatric intensive care units that contributed to PICANET. And then we also worked with 2 smaller district general hospitals that just had cardiology departments and worked with MINAP. They didn't have PICUs. So in total then we introduced this dashboard in 8 clinical units. And we worked with a range of NHS professionals, with doctors, nurses, non-clinical support staff, especially the audit support staff, the people who are deeply involved in collecting NCA data, validating those data and reporting them. And we worked with people at institutional levels within the trust, so with trust board and quality and safety committee members. Today we're going to focus our talk on the clinical unit level, because that's where the dashboard was introduced, and it was introduced there because that's where we found that NCA data were used most intensively in the hospitals. So the study structure, this was a large study that took place over 3 years. So we started in 2017 and we're just coming to an end now. And it was structured around 4 phases. So in the first phase, we carried out a context analysis to develop our initial CMOs, and from those, a technical requirement specification for the dashboard. And the context analysis involved interviews with 54 NHS staff. Then in the second phase of the project, we used those CMOs to co-design the dashboard. Now we worked in this second phase, the co-design phase, with just one of our 5 hospitals. We did that intentionally, and the reason was that we wanted to see if it was possible in working with one hospital to design something that had functionality that was broadly transferable to other contexts. The reason for that was that if this dashboard ended up being useful, and could potentially be rolled out more widely, you would need that level of transferability. So we wanted to test that. So we did the co-design in one hospital, and we did it through a series of co-design workshops. In the first co-design workshop, Mai El-Shahaili, our amazing computer scientist, had used the CMOs to get some initial ideas about the dashboard. And she tested those out with clinical and non-clinical staff in that focus group or workshop. Then she used their feedback and the CMOs to design a prototype dashboard, which she tested with the users in the second co-design workshop. And that prototype dashboard was based on simulated or dummy data. In phase 3 of the study, we used the CMOs to co-design an adoption strategy for the dashboard for each unit, and we did that through a series of focus groups before, in phase 4, introducing the dashboard into all 8 clinical units in the 5 hospitals in the study. And the intention there was to refine our CMOs through ethnographic observations, so through observing people using the dashboard, and also using NCA data more widely, and through informal interviews. So I'm going to pass over to Tasha now, who's going to talk about what we found in the study.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, so I'm just going to speak about how we used CMOs to design and evaluate the dashboard. So as Lynn mentioned, phase 1 of the project was a context analysis. So the first set of CMOs we created were around current use of NCA feedback. So in realist terms, we were looking to answer the questions: how, why, and in what circumstances does NCA feedback stimulate quality improvement in the NHS? And obviously then use those CMOs to inform dashboard design. So in the first instance, we were looking at what does the feedback actually offer to NHS staff. And our participants in the phase 1 interviews reported that there were 2 main sources of feedback. The first was from the NCA suppliers who managed the audits. And across audits, that feedback varied in terms of frequency and format, but typically they were all aiming to produce an annual report that was publicly available and contained national comparator data. And the image that you're seeing on the slide there is just an example from the PeakerNet annual report of the types of things provided. The other source of feedback was via the services themselves. So some services were resourced with audit support staff who managed local databases where data was stored before upload to the NCA supplier. And they were able to extract data from that database and produce reports when requested by clinical staff and managers. And typically what that looked like was bar charts that tracked performance month by month, but obviously it didn't have the national comparator data within that. So after kind of having a better understanding of what the feedback offered, we looked at how people were responding to that. And the central circle provides a list of the mechanisms that we identified. And just to give a couple of examples, so in terms of the responses to the annual public report, some of our respondents reported that they use the metrics such as treatment times to show that they were performing well against peer organisations, and they did that in order to attract referrals to their service over others, so we labelled that as competition. And then in regards to the trust board, our respondents were saying that trust boards respond to the annual report if the service is going to appear as an outlier. And that's particularly in regards to metrics considered publicly sensitive in nature, such as mortality. So the trust board will act to protect the trust reputation for providing safe and effective care. So we labelled that mechanism reputation. The mechanism that was linked most closely with quality improvement efforts and changes in service practice, we termed professionalism, and that was where clinical teams wanted to use data to monitor service performance to ensure that the care that they were providing to their patients was safe and effective. But there were some constraints in use of supplier feedback for use in that capacity. So, for example, people reported that there were challenges accessing data and feedback via the supplier website, and clinicians commented that there's often constraints on their time because obviously they're involved in clinical work for like interacting with the data when it's hard to access. And so that often meant that their interactions with supplier feedback was limited to the annual report. But then there were also issues with that report that were noted. So one of them was about data timeliness. So in one of the reports we were looking at, the data were up to 2 years old, and people were saying that when the data is that old, it's hard for them to make cases for service change because it's not really a reflection of what the service is doing now. So there were a number of constraints on the use of supplier-produced feedback. So where we found that feedback created using NCA data was used most routinely, say for example, every month in clinical governance meetings, was where they were resourced with these audit support staff who were able to produce reports when requested. But a further thing underpinning its use was that it's not just that that clinical teams were supported to produce these reports, it's that the people collecting the data were trusted to collect accurate data. So, and one of the quotes on this slide reflect that the clinicians saying to them, the PeakNet data is the gold standard. They really trust that it's a reflection of their service performance and on which they can make bases for service change. So they were the mechanisms and the context that kind of influenced how NCA feedback was impacting services. So how did this information inform dashboard development? So the CMOs developed helped in the design of the dashboard in a couple of ways. And the first was to do with the metrics. So in discussion of the mechanisms, people were reporting that their responses were in response to particular metrics. And what Mael Shahali, our computer scientist who developed the software, did was look at that in terms of the questions and sub-questions people are using the data to answer. So people typically have like an entry point question. An example might be, how many patients in the previous month died in this unit? So, and depending on what the data says about that question, they might have follow-up questions. So they might want to know if there's a high amount of deaths in the unit, from those deaths, what was the source of admission for those patients? So basically people have those entry point questions to identify if there are any issues in performance. And then they have follow-up questions they might have to interrogate the data and understand why there is a problem with performance in order to inform a response. So understanding what people are actually wanting to do with this data, Mai developed the concept of a qual card, as we call them. And that was a way to kind of, I suppose, provide people with what they needed in the form of a dashboard. So what that looked like, so the top visualization on this slide shows a dashboard home screen with 5 qual card displays. And each qual card has a visualization designed to answer a key or an entry point question. And each of those cards can be expanded, which the bottom picture shows, to display more measures, some of which interact with the main bar chart. And the idea is that by expanding it, then you can do that drill down and interrogation into the data to answer those sub-questions. So that was how, I suppose, the key metrics that people reported would engage users with the dashboard were incorporated into the design. But it wasn't just about the metrics, so the dashboard functions were also included to help overcome some of the constraints reported with use of data in the context analysis, and that included things like providing web-based access, so any member of staff could access the dashboard using service PCs. There was exporting functions, so all the visualizations on the dashboard and the raw data could be exported into different reports so that people could share information in different ways and not just via Qual Dash. And there was also a customization function built in. So that was about although we were working with a national clinical audit, so the metrics first discussed have national relevance, people were saying that locally there might be metrics that are specific to the service that they want to explore that their peer organisations might not have an interest in monitoring. So the customisation feature allowed new call cards to be added or existing call cards to be adapted in order to meet those specific needs of the service. So that was basically what the dashboard was offering to our services. But we didn't install the dashboard and leave it. Our intention was to use an adoption strategy to support uptake and use on sites. And some of the things we did as part of this was we installed the dashboard on local service, and what that did was it provided site staff with control over how frequently data were uploaded into the dashboard, so it could be as timely as possible for them to be helped in usefulness, I suppose. Underpinning the adoption strategy was use of a site champion. So this was someone who would encourage and support use of the dashboard on site. And we had a mixture of clinical and audit support staff who agreed to participate as champions. And in particular, clinicians and consultants were identified as key to this strategy's success, because they were said to be the people who had the authority to lead use of the dashboard in certain contexts. So, for example, they were able to put the call dash or NCA feedback on their meeting agendas and then actually use a dashboard in those meetings to discuss the feedback. The research team developed materials such as an e-bulletin and end-user crib sheets to support its use as well, but they were provided to their site champions so that site staff would receive that information from people that they recognise rather than the external research team. So basically it was a multifaceted intervention. So it was a multifaceted intervention, and then for us, understanding what was offered as part of that intervention, we developed a second set of CMO configurations with QualDash placed as the intervention. So there was a list, I'm just providing two here as an example. But so obviously from the context analysis, we understood that some services were resourced with these audit support staff and were routinely looking at NCA feedback already, whereas other services, NCA feedback was limited to the annual report produced by suppliers. So thinking about how people might respond when QualDash was introduced into those two different contexts, we thought that in the first, audit support staff would choose to use QualDash because it would facilitate their existing work streams. And not only that, but that clinical staff and managers might use QualDash instead of making data requests to the audit support staff. So it would save their time and also enable a greater range of users to interact more, I suppose, productively with NCA data. In the second context, where use of that data were constrained, we thought that through professionalism, so people's desire to use their data to help them provide safe and effective care, and leadership offered through the champions, that QualDash would be used to introduce NCA data into these clinical governance processes where it wasn't used before. And the idea was that across sites, what that would help to do is reduce variation in how NCA data were being used across organisations, and also to increase those opportunities for it to stimulate quality improvement. So they were a couple of hypotheses that we followed through. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we found in practice. So in the sites that were resourced with audit support staff, they were sort of like our first port of call in terms of observations in phase 4 for the evaluation. So you probably won't be surprised to hear that we didn't actually find that they were using QualDash as we had hypothesized. What they were doing, or the majority of them were doing, were continuing to use their existing systems. And when we explored the reasons why, there was a number of explanations given. So the first was around the metric configurations. So installation of QualDash represented the first time that real data were uploaded into the dashboard. And that provided an opportunity for staff to scrutinise it in a way that wasn't done in the co-design workshops, which, as Lynn mentioned, used dummy data. And when they did this scrutinisation, they recognised that some of the metrics weren't configured as that they wanted to report them in the service. So an example is mortality. The services wanted to report them by month of event, whereas Qualdash was displaying it by month of patient admission. So a second issue was about data timeliness. Data was stored in local databases before upload to the supplier and before upload to Qualdash. So reports produced by local databases were always going to be more timely than what Qualdash could offer. And then a final point was around the data sources used by audit support staff. So obviously Qualdash was built using NCA data only, whereas the support staff were using a variety of different sources in order to generate the metrics that were requested from them. And so the combination of those factors working together meant that although Qualdash could be opened and people could play around with the qual cards, it wasn't offering them exactly what they needed in order to be perceived as something that could facilitate their work streams. And one of the quotes on this slide reflect that. The clerk was saying that, you know, she would really wanted to be able to say that Qualdash was useful to her, but unfortunately it just didn't quite provide what she needed to help her in her job. However, there was one site that had an audit clerk that didn't use such a sophisticated local database system. And they said to us that when Qualdash was introduced, although it didn't provide all the metrics they needed, for the ones it did, it saved them a lot of manual work in producing the quarterly reports that were requested from them. So they were really appreciative of what Qualdash, how Qualdash facilitated their work. And as a result, they actually worked to develop routines uploading data into Qualdash in a timely way so it could continue to facilitate their work. So that was in sites already resourced with audit support staff. In sites that you know, were really constrained in how they used NCA feedback. So obviously we saw this as a real opportunity for Qualdash to introduce NCA feedback into their monitoring processes. But a similar issue was reported in these sites as the other sites in terms of when real data were uploaded into the dashboard. So at that point, some of our site champions were able to recognise that the configurations of the metrics weren't as needed by the service. And actually, in one of the sites, what that led to was a request that all of the qual cards undergo a sense check by local site staff with experience or expertise in their data before the wider dissemination of the dashboard happened. So what we found in, I suppose, the early stages of the evaluation was that although obviously a lot of effort went into the co-design process, when real data were uploaded, it became apparent that the dashboard didn't quite offer what they needed to be optimally useful for them. And so it kind of represented a second phase of dashboard development. And obviously, and unfortunately, we were all data collection or face-to-face data collection came to an end when COVID-19 lockdown happened. So we weren't able to progress much past that point. Yeah, so that's just kind of like a summary of what we found. And I'm just going to hand back over to Lynn to reflect on the final learning points for us.
Right, thank you, Tasha. So in terms of lessons learned, especially around using realist approaches in software development as well as evaluation, as Tasha has shown, from the context analysis, we were able to develop initial CMOs about current use of NCA data and what supported and constrained that use, which provided a really useful framework for the dashboard design. So our computer scientist was able to use that to develop good functionality that users welcomed. We then, as Tasha has shown, developed CMOs that theorised the impact that Qualdash would have on care quality and then sought to test that and refine it. And it was in refining those CMOs that we found, as Tasha has said, that the dashboard did need further development if it was to be used routinely. And again, as Tasha said, that was, we think, quite significantly linked to the use of dummy data or simulated data in the dashboard co-design process, because users were only able to see how the dashboard could work for them and tell us what developments were needed when they saw their own data. And in our study structure, they only saw that when phase 4 started, which was meant to be the implementation phase. So as Tasha said, that ended up being a sort of more really of a kind of an extended co-design process. But our computer scientist built the dashboard in a way that it was customizable, and so she was developing a new version which was actually just about to be installed when COVID struck. And we think that the kinds of feedback we were getting show that if that had been introduced and we'd had the time and opportunity to continue working on the dashboard, then we would have seen more use of it. Even so, we learned such a lot from this project. It was absolutely fascinating, and the use of realist methods really helped in terms of getting very good granularity for feedback for the dashboard design. So that's enough of us. Thank you so much for your attention, and yeah, over to you if there's any questions.